Hi, welcome to the introduction to 2 Samuel 13 and 14. I'm really glad to be back now. You may not have noticed, but I was on the road with my wife Sue for a month, and then I wrote another book in the meantime, Creation or Empire, a choice of religions in the Bible, in the church, and in the United States, and it's due out from Orbis in the fall. So having taken a couple of months for that, now I'm glad to be back in 2 Samuel 13 and 14. And as I've been doing in these sections, I'm offering this as an introductory video to this section because there are a number of things that tie these chapters together and a number of questions that scholars look at that are important as we begin to interpret these two chapters together. So if you haven't been following us in chapter 12, of course, I shouldn't say of course you haven't been following, but chapter 11 was the David and Bathsheba situation, and chapter 12, David's court. Prophet Nathan challenged him on the Bathsheba situation with the parable of the rich man, the poor man, the ewe man, and the traveler that we recognized at the time was a master allegory for the entire journey from Exodus to exile. And so we've seen that kind of story. We'll see another story like it in 2 Samuel 14 from the wise woman of Tekoa. And then later we'll see another one, although not all scholars see it as similar, in 1 Kings 3 when we hear that Solomon had a dream. But today we're looking at this, and on the right side of the screen you see a number of the questions that we need to look at. And the first one is, how do the two chapters fit together? And really, before we look at that, I think it's helpful to see how the three chapters fit together, 12, 13, and 14. When I did the introduction to chapters 10 to 12, I was noting that scholars can divide these chapters a number of ways. And so I put 10 to 12 together as the pinnacle and the setting up of the fall of the house of David. But as April Westbrook puts in her book, And He Will Take Your Daughters, Woman's Story and the Ethical Evaluation of Monarchy in the David Narrative, she shows the parallels, and you can see on the left side of the screen, with Bathsheba in 2 Samuel 11 and 12, and with Tamar and the woman of Tekoa in 2 Samuel 13 and 14. And I won't go through this all in detail. We'll look more at it as we look at the details in the following videos. And of course, I'll post it at radicalbible.net, and you can look at it on your own leisure. But we can see a number of parallels here, starting with the setup of a war that the king is fighting. And we won't see much of that in these chapters. In fact, many years go by and there's no report of wars at all. But then there's the sexual violation, David committing adultery with Bathsheba, and then his son Amnon raping his half-sister Tamar, and then all these other elements as we see. And as Westbrook notes, the Bathsheba story is relatively clean, so to speak. We don't hear from Bathsheba. All we hear from her is her announcement that she's pregnant, and David dispatches Uriah without any sense that Uriah knows what's going on. But in this story, we're going to hear the cries of Tamar, and we're going to hear the despising of Tamar by Amnon. And what was hidden in the Bathsheba-David the Bathsheba-David story, behind some of the elements, the way the author narrator put it, is all revealed here. And we'll see a flip side of that in chapter 14. So that's one element. But in addition to that, the question of how the two chapters fit together. And so we can see this here, not only the parallels on the one hand between chapters 11 and 12, and then between 13 and 14, but here are the close parallels between chapter 13 and 14, not least of which is the basic structure that in each a man and a woman talk, one with words provided by a third person. In the case of Amnon, it's Jonadab, his so-called friend, and with the woman of Tekoa, it's Joab. And then we see that it's deceptive speech. It's really about something else. And at first, the person is deceived. First, Tamar is deceived to making food for Amnon, and David is deceived about the woman of Tekoa. In both cases, the woman pleads for nonviolence as a response, but that's not what happens. Male violence is what the response is. And then the advisor returns to speak to the king, and Absalom is involved in both as an aftermath. And so we'll see how closely those are connected together. And one of the other things that we need to look at here is, as we'll see, given the many echoes of Genesis, what do we imagine the direction of echo is? Genesis echoing Samuel, or Samuel echoing Genesis? And I've been highlighting throughout the entire books of Samuel, as well as in my Genesis series here on Radical Bible, that Genesis is almost certainly a post-exilic composition, either from the time of exile in Babylon or the post-exilic period under Persian hegemony in the restored Jerusalem and the province of Yehud, as the Persians called it. But traditionally, scholars have seen the story of the rise of David and the succession as either 10th century on the older view from the four source theory back in the 19th century that we saw, but more recently that the David story is an amalgam from different time periods. And certainly the anti-monarchical thing that begins it in 1 Samuel 8 must come from some later time, because it echoes Deuteronomistic elements that are from the time of King Josiah in around 620 BCE. So there's some real questions of that, and many scholars assume, without providing evidence, that Samuel is echoing Genesis, which is to say, if not the characters in the story, at least the audience of 2 Samuel knows the Genesis story. And one of the key elements is in these echoes of Genesis. And there are many, many of them, but the one that I'd like to really draw attention to here is the question of the argument among two brothers that we see in 14:6, the story that the woman tells, presumably from Joab's words, of two brothers who fight in the field and one of them dies. And that's plainly very similar to the Cain and Abel story. So are we supposed to hear the Cain and Abel story in this story, or do we hear Genesis as a response to this? And that's what I'd like to suggest, but you can decide for yourself as you go. And here's some of the reasons. First of all, there's no mention of Cain and Abel anywhere here, and there's really no explicit reference of Genesis. There's no mention of Abraham or Sarah or Isaac or Rebekah or Jacob or his wives either, although there's a couple little bits, and those are almost certainly insertions later. But there's no reason to assume that this is an insertion, as for the reasons we just saw, that as 11 and 12 fit with 13 and 14, and 13 and 14 fit together, and certainly they're setting up the rebellion of Absalom in chapters 15 to 19 that follows. So this unit is certainly all a very tight unit, and I want to say is written several centuries before Genesis, and Genesis is responding to it. And so therefore, the question of the man fighting, the two brothers fighting in the field, I'd like to suggest, operates much like the parable that Nathan told David. In other words, it operates allegorically at many levels. And what it operates at the level of, if we put aside Cain and Abel, is that monarchy means struggles between men over power. And so, just briefly, let's look at this sequence all the way back to 1 Samuel 3 when Samuel and Eli were rivals over priestly authority. But we see how often it comes out, not just amongst kings, but among others, between Samuel and Saul over control of the monarchy, more obviously with David and Goliath, but then the series of struggles with Saul and David, and Saul with his son Jonathan, and David with Nabal, and Abner with Joab, the two respective generals. And then we see a whole sequence of these, including in our passage, but it continues down through the very end. So perhaps when we get to chapter 14 here, we'll see that one of the levels in which Joab is told the story, obviously not meaning David to hear it that way, but as the audience hearing it that way, is once we get to this level in the story, monarchy simply means brothers are fighting and killing each other. And we'll see more of that again as we go. So, going to question 3 here. Is Amnon's mother Ahinoam Saul's former wife? And we see this is in 3 verse 2 in chapter 3 of 2 Samuel, where we hear that David had a woman named Ahinoam, who's also the name of Saul's wife. And many scholars wonder, are there two Ahinoam? Is that too much of a coincidence? Or has David taken Ahinoam from Saul? Although it never says that he does, even though he has Saul's daughter Michal, and he has Nabal's wife Abigail, so we certainly know that kings take women, and David has certainly taken women from other men, echoing the Grateful Dead, so to speak, there, but we won't get into that detail. So, is that? We'll have to look at it more as we go, but the issue is, if Amnon is a Saulite, then maybe this story is really just about getting rid of the last Saulite, or not quite the last one, but of Saulite within the house of David. And so we'll look at that more as we go. Question 4. Given 2 Samuel 12:11, where Yahweh said, "I will do this," should we see the rape of Tamar and death of Amnon as Yahweh's punishment? And Fackelman suggests that there's dual causation, that although Yahweh is saying, "I will do this," the human beings still have free will. So without trying to parse what's Yahweh and what's the people, any more than we can often parse in the way we might put it, what's nature and what's nurture, which I'd like to suggest is perhaps more parallel than we realize, they're both always involved. Yahweh has a vision and does things, and yet humans have free will and make choices. So we'll see more of that as we go as well. Given the indeterminate time reference that you can see on the left side of the screen here, some time passed, as well as the fact that we'll see a number of descriptions of years passing, how old do we imagine these characters are? We saw at the beginning of Samuel that it told us just with a list that David had sons from different women, but how much time has passed since then we don't know. We have to assume that these sons are old enough to be sexually active, but are they teenagers? Are they in their 20s? What level of development should we expect they have in terms of their maturity and the choices they make? But the text doesn't choose to tell us that, even though it has told us how old David was when he took the reins and how old he is when he ends, because it told us how long he reigned. But we don't hear about any of that here. Then we'll see Jonadab, who's the quote friend that goes to Amnon to give him advice on what to do about his lust for his half-sister. What is his purpose? Where does he come from? In many ways, he's parallel to the serpent in Genesis, as the chart I just showed suggests. But what's his purpose? He's actually a cousin of the family. As it notes here, he's the son of one of David's brothers. And so recalling 1 Samuel 17:28 and David's brother Eliab's anger that young David even went out to see Goliath, perhaps there's an ongoing jealousy of David. And that wouldn't be too surprising given the Joseph parallel story. Joseph's brothers are certainly jealous of him all the way through until they're just afraid of him. So we'll have to explore that more as we go too. In the story in chapter 13, there's an amazing amount of detail about food preparation. Older translations suggest heart-shaped cakes, which is wrong both in the terms of the shape and the substance. It's more like dumplings, boiled dumplings. But we'll see that. But why all the details about the shape and how they're prepared and using different words for food? What all the details about food have to do with rape and have to do with the monarchy? And we'll see that as we go too. Where are the other brothers during the 2 years between the rape and the revenge, including the future royal rivals Adonijah and Solomon? So as we'll see at the end of chapter 13, Absalom apparently has the power to call all the king's sons, not referred to there as his brothers, but the king's sons, together for a party, which leads to a rumor that David hears that all his sons have been killed, but it's really only Amnon that's been killed. But they all run away without being named. And where are they? What do they think of this whole business of Absalom and Amnon and their father? But we hear nothing from them at all. But certainly they've been exposed to this, and that will certainly affect Adonijah and Solomon when we get to the rivalry for succession at the end of the book and the beginning of 1 Kings. Later in chapter 13:39, at the very end, we hear in the New RSV at least that David yearns for Absalom. Or does he? Is that a translation, or does he seek to destroy him? As we'll see, it can go either way. He's either consoled at the death of Amnon and is yearning for his son Absalom, which we'll certainly hear at Absalom's death way later that he'll be mourning for him, or is he seeking to destroy Absalom as a potential rival, as someone who's damaging his family? And since we haven't seen a lot of the internal workings of David, we'll have to discern that as we get there. Moving on to chapter 14. The beginning of it is very strange, and let's just put it up on the screen for a second so we can see the beginning parts we're talking about here. The initial part is simply that Joab perceived that the king's mind was on Absalom, and so he sent to Tekoa and brought from there a wise woman. So why all this? Why Tekoa? What do we know about Tekoa? Did he know about this woman? Is there a particular woman there? It doesn't say the wise woman, like she's well known. Is that a technical term, a wise woman? Or is there's something else? And why does she go along with him? Does she consent? Is she in on this? We don't know, but we'll need to speculate a little bit to know what her mood is when she returns to the king with her message. And that also covers question 11. And she's described as a wise woman. What exactly is her wisdom? Is it her wisdom? Is it Joab's wisdom? And we'll see that it interacts with David's wisdom and with Jonadab's wisdom, representing the snake, perhaps. So, how does the story she tells about two sons in the field relate to the rape of Tamar and Absalom's revenge? In other words, the story isn't exactly parallel. And maybe that's a strategic thing on Joab's part. An exact parallel story would be too transparent, just like the story that Nathan told about the rich man, the poor man, the ewe lamb, and the traveler was not exactly parallel either. But this is farther afield. And not only that, the story seems to shift as she goes on. And so, what is the connection there between the beginning of her story, the middle of her story, and the rape of Tamar and Absalom's desire for revenge? It's a very convoluted story, and many scholars have noted the many layers that some readers often miss for not looking closely enough. So we'll look very closely at that. And that relates also to question 13. How do we interpret the seemingly confusing exchange between the woman and her lord, the king? She says things, then David seems to demur, and then she says other things, and David reacts. But to the ordinary reader in our context, it's not always clear exactly what's going on. So we'll have to look more closely at the language and the sequence as we go. So near the very end of chapter 14, given his sudden appearance, and if I scroll down here on the left side, you can see what's going on. David's been talking to the woman throughout, and then suddenly in verse 21, the king said to Joab, like he was there all along. So, do we imagine Joab has been listening from the door to the king's and the woman's conversation, or is the text omitting his arrival after the fact? And this has everything to do with whether he is listening to the question of whether she's actually reporting the words that he said. Notice that David didn't get to see in the previous situation what happened to Uriah when he sent the message with Uriah to Joab at the front of the war, and Joab changed the language as we saw there. But we don't get to hear what Joab said to the woman, so we don't know if she's reporting the language carefully or not, accurately or not, and we don't know right now whether he was listening to make sure of that or not, or at least to find out what it is she actually told the king, so we can know what the king knows and what the king doesn't know, according to what he told her. So, penultimately here in verse 15, in the announcement of Absalom's offspring in 1427, which I can show us right here, born to Absalom as if they came out of his body, 3 sons and 1 daughter whose name was Tamar, named, of course, after his sister. What about the women? Given that this is the third of 3 chapters about women in the life of David, Bathsheba, Tamar, and the wise woman here, why no wife or mother for Absalom? Never mentioned. And then finally, by the end of chapter 14, 7 years have passed since the rape of Tamar. We've seen a couple references of 2 years passing, another one of 3 years passing. What is we imagine has been happening in all this time? Are they all just cooling their heels? Has David been to war? What about everybody else in the story? What do we imagine is going on with the author telling us that this is all simmering for 7 long years? So a lot going on there, and we'll also look at, in addition to that, some of the ways that it's shaped into chiasms, as we've been doing here, and not all scholars see that. We can see it here from chapter 13, the first part from Fackelman, and the second part from me, and we'll see similarly a chiasm in chapter 14 in this shape here. So buckle your seatbelts as we begin to enter into chapter 13 next time and explore how the house of David begins to come down before the people of Israel. See you next time for that. Bye-bye.